Hello and welcome to Talking Telecoms Week. I'm Annie Turner, editor of Mobile Europe, and today we're going to be looking at what generative AI could deliver to telecoms in the coming years. And I am delighted to welcome Michael Lesniak from SK Telecom, who's going to discuss this with me. And please note that this broadcast will be available on demand later. So, Michael, just before we get going, could you say a little bit about your job within SK Telecom and how it relates to our topic today? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
So I've been at SK Telecom for a little more than 10 years now, starting out through our subsidiary SK Planet, working on mobile service development. So as you know, SK Telecom's pretty innovative in developing services, consumer-facing services. So we did a lot in mobile. And then as the 5G era came around, I moved with some of my colleagues to work on use cases development for 5G. And so really what we were looking at was a convergence of not just the network technology and the software on that, but things like now we would call metaverse, but at that time just AR, VR, mixed reality, and AI and Web3, and those were sort of the really key, and IoT, right? And so when you think about so it's something that we've been working on for a while. I've done projects for a variety of things over the years, and I think you see them all starting to really converge now. And so the generative AI is going to have a big impact on how we work in the next few years. And I think having a variety of use cases, experience with a variety of use cases, it gives me quite a different perspective to where it will be useful and how.
Okay, so maybe.
Sorry. And I also did help with. I did help earlier this year. I did help put together our global telco AI alliance. I should point that out. So that would be relevant. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. So I was just thinking that maybe we should start by looking at where a lot of the focus has been so far about where generative AI could play a part. And that's looking at direct customer facing stuff like customer journeys and next best options. And also, I mean, does it mean that chatbots are going to take over customer service and do a better job? So could we just start by looking at that area and what you think about that?
Yeah. So if we could start with chatbots, that would be pretty interesting, I think. And I think that's important because if you look at the research that's being done by some of the companies that are promoting different services in the cloud or some sort of layer of AI in the cloud, they've done a lot of research into what are telcos looking at. And pretty much everybody is already looking at what they're calling chatbots. It's like 90% in some of the surveys, right? And it's really strange because they're fundamentally different technologies, right? So like a chatbot is built on what you might call like an old AI, right? It's a traditional AI. So it's a rules-based system, and, they're very helpful for certain things. And I think one good example that's super basic is like an FAQ, right? So putting a generative AI system to help users understand the FAQ is overkill. So if you're thinking of, I want to use AI, which is what everybody wants to use AI, almost in every use case, the primary key decision factor is to increase efficiency or improve productivity. So we're going to take a use case that works perfectly fine with the technologies there. We're going to apply generative AI for some reason. I don't know why, just because it's cool. It's not really helping anything. It's not making it more efficient. It's not making it more productive, right? So we have to understand what is a chatbot versus what is generative AI. So okay, so then you can think about if you have those rule systems and you have people asking very specific questions and oftentimes not very good or well thought through questions and getting some very sort of very pre-programmed results returned. okay, so then let's say like, okay, well, maybe the customer doesn't understand what they're supposed to be asking, right? So, okay, maybe then there's a system that escalates that to a next level chatbot. Now it's no longer really chatbot. Let's call it chat GPT, right? So now we're using predictive models that understand language really well. And they're trained on not structured data. So it's like totally opposite of what traditional chatbots are, which are highly structured data. And now we're looking at just as unstructured as it depends on which model you're working with and who's doing the training. But generally speaking, now you're talking about unstructured data, and then you're using that information to hopefully predict the correct response. And there's lots of ways. Then you can you can perhaps use the existing frameworks that we've created for chatbots, for example, to then create context for the generative AI program so that it's speaking in an intelligent way that's relevant to what the customer wants. And I think that's how you use those legacy systems to inform sort of the next generational of AI interface, let's say, some sort of chat interface. But I wanted to make that distinction because we have this idea because we've used chatbots for many years now, and they're not really the same thing. So it's not just saying we're making a better chatbot, because then people have these ideas, depending on who you're talking about, what a chatbot is and what a chatbot does. And probably there's some poisoned well in that experience as well for a lot of people. So we want to take it away and say, wait, this is a conversation that you're having with the machine, and these are the ways that we're making it better. So I think it's different. So I wanted to point that out first, and then I can. Do you want to take a break and talk about that for a minute, or do you want me to go back to your customer journey question?
And I just think it's the way terms get bandied about, and the meaning becomes quite confused, and the issue becomes quite confused, and people use terms in a very inaccurate fashion, which just creates great market confusion.
Yeah, I think it can happen. What
you said was a really good kind of example and summary of a lot of what we're hearing in the market right now, but around chatbots and generative AI, and the difference between what's gone before and what is possible going forward.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. And you see, like, some of the research. I'm just going to take a look at some of my notes here. So in terms of customer journey, I think now that's like on the OTT side. So I think let's start with the most important thing. So I'm looking at this also from the perspective of Web3 and metaverse as being important parts of those use cases moving forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for new types of use cases. And I think some of those use cases, carriers will have a really good opportunity to produce use cases for. And in some cases, they'll have a good opportunity and then they'll probably not do a good job executing it. And in other cases, there'll be players who do a great job executing it. You'll have a whole spectrum of companies. And I think we can touch on like what this means for the landscape. There's going to be winners and losers, right? But I think for companies that are able to position themselves well, regardless of what they do with those use cases, whether they do it greenfield or they acquire a company or they find right vendors, however they execute on that, one thing that carriers have a great opportunity right now in is owning identity and being a really important player in terms of owning that customer relationship, just like they have owned for a couple decades now, right? And I think when you look at like that understanding that position, that's the start of the customer journey. You can't do anything without KYC, and we've done the KYC. So we have the KYC.
We've done your customer KYC, yeah.
Yes, know your customer, right? So we've done that. So we've done that. We've fulfilled that role in an effective way for many years, and we can start that journey for lots of different things there. And so when we're talking about generative AI, there's a lot of debate, like proof of humanity. Like, okay, this is a new idea. Like, I mean, know your customer is perfectly fine, but let's call it the proof of humanity, because at some point we might have customers who aren't human because they're agents working for other people. Okay, but that's really like far down the line, to be honest. Like, it's fun to imagine that there's like everybody's driving some version of Tesla and that nobody actually drives anymore. But it's not the reality today for a variety of reasons. So it's not just about the technology, right? So like those use cases are happening, but let's just say like we own your customers. So we know we start there. So, I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas around how we need to start any journey with our position as owning that customer, whether it's using Web3, generative AI, our existing infrastructure. There's all sorts of ways that we do that. But generative AI is going to change then, okay, once we have that position, we retain that position, we are verifying for other customers and other services that this is a real person. This is who they say they are. So this is when I talk about generative AI with people earlier in the year. So look, if you want to understand where the use cases are for every telco, let's start with a place where all telcos have already done a great job collaborating to identify use cases. And one example of that is Kamara. And you can look at Kamara and say, like, here's a list of APIs that all telcos have agreed are relevant to use cases that we can deliver on the network. And
so
some of those are
about the GSMA Open Gateway Initiative that was announced at Mobile World Congress, and Kamara, or Camera, however you pronounce it, is integral to that. Yeah, okay.
That's right. Yeah, however it's pronounced, I have no idea. We just call it Kamara in Korea. I honestly, Kamara. But one of those standards is KYC, obviously. And then there's a few others that are really interesting for the journey. So we have a really interesting role to play. For example, quality on demand is a really interesting one, and that's really interesting for a few reasons. So let's start with quality on demand. So let's just pick one, just because it's, we're talking use cases, generative AI. So let's say I'm using generative AI in some sort of metaverse type experience, right? Okay, so this metaverse type experience, I want to now use, I want to be able to experience something in augmented reality in my city for some reason. Maybe it's a concert, maybe it's some sort of like content that I want to experience at a facade that is, it's unique to this time, and I want to take a picture with it, and there's a famous movie star there and they're dancing, and that's there. And now, but I want that experience to be really good, right? So, how do I use generative AI to create something that's customized for me, that's using whatever existing content's there, but I'm creating something that's customized for me as well, because it's generative, right? It's supposed to create something with it. And then how do I use the network infrastructure to demand better quality of service for that instance, so that I know this is going to be a smooth experience, right? And so how do we do that? So that's a really interesting way that we can integrate what we do really well already with new use cases. I think another one that's perhaps more interesting in terms of revenue, and I think this is really important in terms of revenue, and that is, one of the best drivers of revenue other than data is carrier billing. And I think that generative AI has a really interesting opportunity for carriers to use SMS or RCS to communicate directly with customers and initiate transactions, right? So the customer is already there. We know the customer is there, so we can trust that this payment is being fulfilled. It can go through direct carrier billing, right? And they don't need to download anything, right? They can just converse with a provider of a service on our network directly with the customer, and we can facilitate that in a way that doesn't include the customer going through the steps of verifying who they are to Apple or Google or someone else, then creating an app store account, then validating a payment system, then downloading the app. Like there's a lot of steps there that we forget, right? But when you think about a new customer, and we're looking at new customers, right? Let's think about old customers. We're used to all the stuff that we're already doing, but we're looking at, okay, who's next? Like it's kind of cumbersome to sign up for new services, right? So if we're looking at, okay, when teens come on board and they're now in their 20s, what are they going to expect, right? They're not going to want this cumbersome sign-up process that we've created through decades now of understanding all the threats and issues that there are with mobile services. So now we have one single point of KYC, the carrier, it's already there. So now we can just bring in those services that already exist and let them engage directly with the customer in a seamless way that cuts out a lot of the friction. So I think that's a really interesting way that we can then communicate with them. And that includes a lot of generative AI. And that goes into sort of like the big bets category. Like, how do you create an engaging agent, not a chat bot, but an agent that can represent some unique use case or transaction for a customer, whether it's buying tickets or buying pizza, or just figuring out where to go, right? Like wayfinding and stuff like that. So there's all sorts of interesting ways that I think, anyway, that we can engage ourselves in those.
I'm just thinking that carrier billing has been talked about for a really long time as a big potential source of income for network operators. And after all, this is the number one issue on all of their agendas, is new and additional revenues. So you think that generative AI might well provide the means and the spur for this to really take off? And you're thinking particularly that's true in the metaverse?
Oh, well, I think, no, not necessarily just the the metaverse is it's a can of worms. It's a can of worms, right? Let's say, so the metaverse is a can of worms. I'm not a particular fan of that term. I mean, it's fine. It's a great term. It's really easy and catchy to, catch everything. But, the metaverse for me is really very VR centric because I read the book and I just can't get out of my head. But for lack of a better term, for all these sort of immersive experiences, that's going to be really relevant. Direct carrier billing, though, is more about text, right? So it's more about what you think of as conversational commerce traditionally, right? So if you think about messengers as a platform, which is a term that I used many years ago working on we acquired a Kakao competitor here in Korea, and we were, I benchmarked WeChat and created this system called Messenger as a platform. And I was comparing it to RCS. And then Google bought Jibe, and the RCS became quite good after that. So it's sort of like, but this idea that you can use messaging to connect directly with customers, right? So what I'm saying for that use case is, is there a way to fundamentally alter the way those services are distributed on the network, right? By cutting out a lot of cumbersome steps. That's what I'm trying to say. So and that could be there could be some use cases that's going to be great for, other use cases that are going to be less great for. But if you're talking about communicating, right, with customers, so using rather than just spamming people with SMS, right? But if there was hey, text Joe's Pizza if you want to order a slice, and you're just talking with through the network infrastructure on SMS, and it's directing to Joe's Pizza, and then you're paying through the carrier, and that's all handled, right? So I think there's a lot of things to be resolved to make something like that happen. But I think this sort of conversational commerce is a potential for carriers, right? And that would drive revenue for carrier billing. Even though carrier billing is quite successful, I would say, in a lot of countries already. It's really hard to, So I think it just drive more growth for carrier billing because it's reducing friction. So anything that reduces friction is going to drive revenue.
Okay, could you tell me a bit more about what SK Telecom's doing with generative AI and how you specifically, you may or may not be able to give me detail, I don't know, but I just wanted
I cannot.
That's a shame.
No, so I can tell you that we've done this alliance, and then after we did the alliance,
the Operator AI Alliance.
Yes, and right now it's not that many carriers. It's SK Telecom, Deutsche Telekom, Singtel, and then we work with a few of the the foundational model providers like OpenAI or Anthropic. I think it's public that we made an investment in Anthropic, which I think was a really good decision.
$100 billion, I think, in August or something like that.
Yeah. We were late to the game. $100 million at this point is like nothing to Anthropic, but it's a meaningful investment. It's a meaningful investment, but Like those companies are so highly valued right now that
I
unfortunately,
feel though that
yeah.
your investment was a little different though from some of the big tech companies say, in that you seem to have something very specific you wanted to achieve.
Sure. So I think, and that's the case. So I think
rather than just a blanket, let's chuck some money.
Definitely. So it's definitely a strategic investment. I'm not on the investment team, so I'll be very careful. Caveat, like, everything I say could be totally wrong, and I do not represent SK Telecom's official position in any way. So that's my disclaimer. But I would say that, if you just look at the general conversations that companies are having, like Databricks or Anthropic or OpenAI, and Inflection AI is another one that's quite popular. So if you listen to the conversations they have, I think you can understand quite what that relationship is. So all of them are getting lots of opportunities. Lots of people want to work. Lots of companies want to work with them, but it's very expensive for them to do these things. And they're not interested in working with a lot of different companies. And so what the value that we brought is that, look, we're going to work with lots of carriers, right? And we're going to help build we're going to help use these models to create some contextually specific use cases for telecom, right? And I think that's really at a high level what we're achieving, and why those companies are interested in taking they're oversubscribed. They don't have to take our money, right? So that's why they're willing to take our money. That's why they're willing to work with us. I think it's because they're seeing, like, it's not just one use case, right? And it's not just one company. It's, we're looking at how do we make an impact on the industry.
So something I find quite interesting is, how fast ChatGPT got to 100 million users is like insane. And we know that these cycles are getting shorter and shorter. So we kind of had this thing about everything was going to happen instantly, and obviously things don't. Because if you just want to use it to play around with, or for very discrete, specific, small tasks, then probably it is pretty quick. But looking at it in the longer term, like you are, for example, with Anthropic, I'm just wondering what your feeling is about time frame. I mean, when do you really think we'll feel the impact in generative AI in telecoms? I mean, is it going to be 2 years? Is it going to be 5 years? And I mean, nobody knows the answer, but what's your feeling?
Well, first, I'd like to point out something that you mentioned, which is like how quickly ChatGPT got to 100 million users. Number one of the most important factors for that is that it wasn't a mobile app. So like I was saying before, like if you can reduce the friction, and you provide something that's compelling and people can just do it right away, you're going to get to 100 million users a lot more quickly, because they don't have to do anything. They just log on and try it, right? So you're just putting it right into their hands. So I think that's an important factor, that piece of the story doesn't get told. Mobile is full of friction, and ChatGPT had no friction. Here's this really cool thing, try it. Sure, I can try that. I don't have to sign up. I don't have to put my email in there. I don't have to do I just log in and try it. Oh, cool, I'll do that. So that's really important. I think that it's also important to point out how quickly those numbers kind of went down. And I don't know the existing numbers, but I think that some of the debate about that was like, yeah, it's down by the percentage of users that are like college students during the summer, right? Because like no one was using it to write. Yeah, but I think that's a really important point too, because it gets to what's the use case, which is really what your question is, right? So how is it impacting telecom? It's already impacting telecom. People are using it to write emails. People are using it to write reports. People are using it to generate summaries. People are using it to increase their productivity already. And so it's already impacting people. And it's just another example of AI where it's like, we've done this incredible thing and everybody's really excited for a little while. And then they're just like, okay, so that's normal. And like the bar of being impressive just gets pushing farther and farther and farther away. So nobody's ever impressed. And so I think, people are already using it and people are adopting it. I think it's still expensive though. So that's another important gate that you see. Like, it's still like, $20 a month. It's not like everybody's going to want to pay $20 a month for that. Right. So how do you use it in a way that's effective That's cost effective and things like that. So I think just figuring out the cost of those services is going to take 5 years.
I'm also thinking that generative AI systems are these huge embedded systems that, the front end, if you like, that people have been experimenting with is agile and simple and blah, blah, blah. But I'm just thinking that these huge systems, that's how you get the speed and the creativity. But I'm thinking about, to use them, they've got to be integrated with other systems, many of which were not designed to be integrated with generative AI, and many of which might be quite old.
That's a really good point. So that's getting into more like real direct impact to the telecom. I'm so glad that you framed it that way. So like, that's been my point as well. Internally, we have these discussions. I mean, I think we have a lot of our own in-house systems. Some were made with vendors, some were just made for ourselves. You've got ERPs. We talk about like, let's just focus on one use case, which everybody's talking about, which is customer service, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're going to use generative AI to transcribe and summarize call data, that's something you could probably do pretty quickly. And that's going to be helpful, and it's going to impact, and it's going to help, right? Because transcribing and coding information, coding not like JavaScript coding, but coding it as like, what are the keywords that I'm extracting from this text? So that's going to help a lot, and that's going to save a lot of money and a lot of time, and it's going to help customers have better experiences. So that'll be impacted, and that's pretty quick. That's probably 2 to 3 years. Everybody will be doing it. It's my guess. I'm an optimist. I'm always a little bit too fast. So let's say 3 to 5 years. But people are already doing it now too, right? And so that's coming quickly. The more difficult stuff are the things that you're saying is like, how do we optimize the customer experience, like on the call, like what we tell before, like so you have these layers in customer service, right? So layer 1, chatbot, right? Well, layer 1 is your website. Let's just say layer 1 is the website. What does it say on your website? Okay, that's going to have some impact from generative AI, right? Then layer 2 is the chatbot, right? So hopefully we use generative AI to make the frameworks that we're creating for those rule-based systems, whether it's an FAQ or frequently asked questions or some other sort of very structured data, right? That you want people to sort of guide people. Like, everybody has what you have, man. Just look at this, right? And so like those things are going to be improved with generative AI, but pretty simple, and they'll probably be operated with legacy stuff. But then you get into the next level, which is like, now I want somebody to actually speak with me as a conversational AI to help understand my problem better and hopefully solve it without me having to transfer that person to a human being. Okay, well, now that's a little bit farther out, right? Like, how do we do that? Because now that system needs to be integrated into all my product data, needs to be integrated with the customer data. It needs to be integrated with other customers' data and information. It needs to know a lot of stuff. And that comes from, like what you said, it's going to come from these legacy systems. Like, I'm sorry, did anybody ask SAP if they have an API set for me to use with my generative AI platform? Like, I'm pretty sure the answer is no.
And charging and billing and blah, blah, blah. I mean, all those things that have been chugging away in the background forever.
Yeah. So now that said, Google, Amazon, even Amdocs, like there are companies that are building some interesting stuff right now. I think the marketing is probably a lot cooler than the tech is at this point, just my guess. But I'm sure it's there, like there's definitely going to be meaningful pilots happening, So 3 to 5 years, that's my number. Depending on where you are in the world. Korea will be 3 to 5 years. I'd say it'd be pretty meaningful, pretty widespread. Other markets, it depends on the cost. I was listening to a really interesting interview recently, which like, to me, it just makes me giggle because the valuations of these companies right now are so like stratospheric. But like, what happens when, transformers become an efficient bit of software and like it costs way less to build these things. And then you just spent like, $1 billion on a data center that you don't need, like these are the kinds of things that, like, I think it's really interesting. So I think the costs are going to go down, and that's going to make it much easier for people for it to proliferate. So like for it to really proliferate, in a meaningful way, that's like sort of like carrier scale. Like when we think of like, there's, because we sell, like I use the analogy, like for us, one of the biggest challenges we have when we do use cases is that our benchmark is like everybody has shoes. Like, yeah, everybody has shoes. Like I want to get into the fashion industry and my benchmark is I want to make shoes. Like it's a really high bar because everybody has at least one pair of shoes, right? So it's the same thing with everybody has a mobile subscription and a lot of people have more than one in terms of their devices and things, right? So like it's a really high bar, but I think generative AI will get there as we learn the technology better and the costs come down. And then we can, as the costs are coming down, we'll also be developing use cases through pilots and things like that, understanding how to integrate them with. And some of these old systems will just have to be replaced, in my opinion. I think there's going to be a lot of money invested in these enterprise side.
I think that's kind of an ongoing process in telecoms.
Anyway,
anyway, isn't it? Really,
it is. So it's a good opportunity for companies, for vendors. It's also a good opportunity for telecoms to really look at their OpEx, right? So not just how do I improve the systems for customer service, but how does that affect my operational cost, right? Like if I implement these technologies, it's going to save my money. So now I know my budget for replacing these software systems, right? And that's, I think, going to be really important. I know it's really important in Europe anyway. I know like a lot of carriers are selling off a lot of infrastructure and things with concern for OpEx and things. So OpEx is a big concern for everybody. But I think I think in Europe, you see a lot of, I've read a lot of things about European carriers are interested in OpEx more so than maybe the US or in Korea. I mean, Korea, we care about OpEx, but maybe we're just not noticed
to the same degree, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe not the same, because our ARPU is like super high. Yeah, it's like US and Korea are very, I think, similar.
Yeah, we have much lower. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And sharpen the concentration somewhat.
Yeah. But then, there's other systems too. So like there's some of the things like I think we mentioned before was maybe network planning, for example. Like how do you use network maintenance? How do you use generative AI for network planning and maintenance? I'm going to pull up my notes here. So I was actually really interested in this and I'm trying to find, and this is, people are talking about it, but there's not a lot of research published about it. And I'm trying to find stuff because I'm interested too.
Early days, really, isn't it?
It is. So I found it. It is. So I found an IEEE RFP, request for proposals for generative AI use cases. And there's like a really cool list. So that, there's things like, generative AI for wireless signal processing, generative AI for semantic communication over wireless networks, generative AI for, energy efficient training and inference on wireless networks, generative AI for vehicular IoT and applications for generative AI on wireless networks. So there's all these interesting things like that are understanding. Then there's things like network protocol design, physical layer design, and resource allocation. Now, those are also things I'm really interested. So I think we're going to get a pipeline of research coming out. And you hear people talking about generative AI in medicine and medical research, right? But, our industry is built on physics, right? And understanding how you use that physics to create better experiences is really the fundamental core of this industry. And I was listening to a researcher at Nokia talking about this, and it was really brilliant. So I think this is a good way to conceptualize this. And it was about conceptualization. We see a lot of use cases for generative AI and images because it's easy for us to benchmark that a human being can recognize a cat when they're 2 or 3 years old 100% of the time, and a machine can't. And so we're trying to get the machine to do things that people do really well. But things that we don't do really well are things like visualize spectrum. Like we don't do that. Like you can feed a machine the mathematics and it will understand it perfectly right away. But people need visualization more than those generative AI models are going to need. So she was talking about how we can use this. We're talking a lot right now about generative AI and how it does things that humans do. Like, does it do what humans do as well as people do? Or does it do it better? And like, what's the fault? And that's to your timeline. Like, I have a lot of opinions about that. But then you think, but the other question is, how do you apply it to things that are actually things that humans don't do really well? So how do we use generative AI in research sectors when you're talking about things that people have a hard time to conceptualize, because it just gets very complicated at a certain scale, right? So that's a really interesting way. And I think that's going to help us, planning, the future of the network and things. And those are areas that I'm not an expert in, but I'm just really excited that there's going to be physicists using generative AI to create better, ways to communicate. So I think that's one. Sorry. So I have a bunch of things more to say on this, but maybe I'll just.
But I was just going to. Well, let's carry on with this. But what I'm just thinking about is that really, it sounds like whatever the time scale is, as you say, that will vary in different parts of the world, and maybe some parts of the world will use generative AI to leapfrog. But yeah. I mean, I think we're going to be seeing a time when generative AI is kind of just embedded in nearly everything, and we'll almost kind of forget it's there. And you know what I mean? It's just so ubiquitous.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think this is where we have a lot of interesting work to do. And this is really what affects the timescale, is really our agreement as a society of how to implement this technology is going to take a lot of time as well. So assuming that we can all agree on a global scale how to use this, right? Then we're talking about 3 to 5 years, right? I mean, that's just building software, right, that works with systems that we have. But then you're talking about things like, okay, so like, let's think about it, like medicine. Let's just talk about this. Like, how can we use generative AI to improve medical practice, right? Telemedicine has been an industry thing. Like, we do some really cool stuff with Excalibur, but we work with this. We use, it's not really generative AI. I'm sure they're exploring it, but it's using MEC we put a machine learning algorithm on our edge, and we use that to return prognosis suggestions to veterinarians around specific types of X-ray data for dogs and cats, right? And it's a really cool software, and they want to expand to other animals. But there's a reason why we don't really look at humans, right? Like, yeah, humans are complicated, but they're not that much more complicated. The issue is people are concerned about medical information and how it's used. But it's not just a privacy issue. It's like doctors and nurses and hospitals and their whole operational process to consider when we're talking about these things. And I was just talking with a lawyer about this the other day. Like, how do you qualify in the United States? A lot of the regulations, according to this lawyer, was, that were built around ideas that lawyers in New York City, for example, shouldn't be held to the same standard as lawyers in Iowa when doctors in New York City shouldn't be held to the same standard as doctors in Iowa when discussing things like a farming accident, right, on a tractor, because the New York City doctor may not have seen those types of accidents as much, right? Those kinds of things. Okay, so what's the liability? Like, how do you resolve that? The answer is we don't know. We still haven't resolved that, even for the internet 1.0, not even like 2.0, right? So we're still figuring this stuff out. So a lot of these use cases that we think of that we can do that technically may be possible, I think they're going to be held back just by the fact that there's an economy out there, right? And that economy is not just dollars and cents. It's really about people and how they interact and how they want to interact, right? And like, how do we agree to interact? So I think that's going to have an impact on the timeline as well.
Michael, I'm afraid we're out of time. That was a great conversation. Thanks a lot for your time and your inputs.